everyone, thank you for tuning in to this video training on downward facing dog. Downward facing dog is a common posture in yoga sequences. Sometimes we hold it for a longer period of time and other times we just use it to transition through different sequences. So it's one that we really want to try and nail into our muscle memory to get right in our body, and it will be unique for each and every single one of us. So today I'm just going to take you through from the ground up in quite a lot of detail. It's something that you will need to practice. You'll need to look in a mirror, so do it in front of a long mirror if you can, and just really try and ingrain it into your brain so that when you come into it in class, you can more quickly come into your version of downward facing dog that feels good for you. So we'll start with hand positioning. I've done a video on this. I've done some short segmented videos on this on Instagram and Facebook, but we're going to do a whole training now today on downward facing dog. So hand placement. When we are using our hands in any way bearing weight, we want to have active hands. So we really want to have the fingers wide apart. We want to grip the fingers into the floor. We want to grip down through the fingertips and through the knuckles, particularly through the knuckle of the index finger and the thumb, and almost creating some lift, almost like there's a suction cup on the palm. So you're lifting the center of the palm up towards the ceiling and avoiding putting pressure through this area of the wrist, the carpal tunnel. So often what I see in class is the hands quite relaxed, quite passive, and a lot of force going through this area of the wrist. There's lots of little bones here, and if this area gets compressed, it can cause inflamed. This can cause compression of the carpal tunnel nerve, which goes through here, which can cause wrist pain. So really want to have our active tiger paws clawing into the mat, grounding through the fingertips and through the knuckles, pressing them down into the floor, pushing the force away through the hands. And you can almost create that action of sort of opening two jars away from each other to really sort of create that force in through the hands and enable that to lift the hips up and away from you in downward facing dog. So that's hand position. You can have the hands level, that's ideal, but if that feels strange in your body, so if that causes any pain in the shoulders or any pain in the spine, it might just be that your hands, your alignment is slightly different. So play around with maybe putting one hand slightly in front of the other and just see which feels best in your shoulders, which feels best in your spine. So that's your hand positioning. We come through then to the head and the neck. We want the ears to be in line when our arms are overhead with our biceps. So we're gazing towards the mat, towards the floor. And we want our shoulders to elevate and widen apart. So if you lift your arms up overhead for me now, you'll notice that your shoulder blades widen apart and lift up as you glide your arms up and overhead. So we want to mimic that action in downward facing dog. That's how our shoulder blades are designed to move, to enable us to lift our arms overhead. So we're moving with the natural natural movement of how things work. So that's what we want to do. We want to think of widening the shoulder blades and lifting them up as we lift our arms up and overhead. So we've nailed the hand position. We've got our ears running alongside our biceps. Our shoulder blades are broadened and lifted. And as we want to think about the position of our spine. So our spine, we want to have it in an alignment where we are tilting the pelvis down towards the floor. So if we start with a neutral spine position, bringing your thumbs underneath your ribs and your index fingers to the front of your pelvis, then what we want to do is we've found that flat position. So it's like a flat rectangle or square. If you stick your bottom out behind you, then you're going to come into that anterior tilt. So we've got the index fingers now have come underneath the thumb. If we tuck the bottom underneath us, we come into a posterior pelvic tilt and the index fingers come in front. So find that neutral position now. So that's where we've aligned the index fingers directly underneath the thumbs. So when we're in downward facing dog, we're going to have more of an anterior pelvic tilt, which is where we send the bottom behind us and those index fingers are coming underneath the thumbs. And when you're in downward facing dog, it's really helpful to reach one hand back and just make sure that you've got a natural curve, a concave curve in the lower back. So that's what we're looking for in downward facing dog. So thinking of lifting the hips up and back in downward facing dog and having that natural concave curve. So what you'll find is that you might need to bend your knees in order to maintain that natural concave curve in the lower back, or you might need to have the heels lifted off the floor, and that is absolutely fine. And once you've got the back into that nice long straight position, then you can straighten the legs a little bit without changing the position of your back, just to increase the stretch. I hope that makes sense. In terms of the legs, and we will do all of this on the mat together in a minute, the legs can be sort of hip width apart, or you can try it even wider. So some people prefer to have the feet wider apart. That's totally okay. So have a play around with what feels more comfortable in your body. For me, it is about hip width apart, but it varies for everyone. So play around with having your feet wider, bringing them, you can even bring them together. Really, it doesn't matter. It's wherever it feels comfortable for you. Try and keep the feet relatively straight. So we don't want the ankles to be rolling in or rolling out. The feet nice and straight, heels pointing towards the back of the mat. And so yeah, let's take all this onto the mat and put it into practice. So start in all fours and bringing the hands out in front of you. Just take them slightly further out in front of you than your shoulders, and just check in with the hands. So we want the fingers nice and wide apart. We want to be gripping the hands into the mat, so gripping them like tiger paws, clawing into the ground, grounding through the fingertips and through the knuckles. Imagine you can create that lift through the palm, that sort of suction cup, and try to avoid pressure through that heel of the hand. So we're gripping into the mat. From here, we're going to tuck our toes, take a breath in to lift the knees up off the mat. And exhale, lift the hips up and back. So the first thing we're going to do is check in with our head position. We want our ears to be running alongside our biceps. Pressing into the hands and lifting your hips up and away from you. So tilt the pelvis down towards the mat. And here we're going to reach back to check the concave curve of the lower back. So take one hand. Can you feel that nice concave curve, that neutral spine? That's all good. So bend the knees, lift your heels as much as you need to maintain that concave curve of the back. And then from there, maintain that position. You can stretch the heels down towards the floor to increase the stretch across the back of the thighs, across the back of the calves. Then you can play around with here with your foot position. So you can widen the feet apart. How does that feel? Bring them back together. How does that feel? Where is your happy place? So play around with it. Don't be afraid to change it at any point, and just see where it feels most comfortable in your body. Now the other thing as well is the length of the downward facing dog. So come back out for a moment. We've been there for a while. So the length of the downward facing dog will vary for everyone. So some people feel more comfortable with the hands and the feet further apart from each other, and some people can have quite a short downward facing dog. So let's play around with that for a moment. So come back to all fours, bring the hands slightly out in front of your shoulders, tuck your toes, lift your knees, take a breath in. Exhale, reach the hips up and back, downward facing dog. So from here, you can play with shortening it. Bring the hands a little bit closer towards your feet. Ooh, that feels quite tight on my hamstrings and my calves. And maybe see if you can walk the hands a little bit further away. That feels a little bit more comfortable to me. So play around with the length of your downward facing dog, the length between your hands and your feet, to see what feels most comfortable for you. The other thing that I haven't mentioned, which is important, is the engagement of the core here. So of course, our spine is elevated, we're bearing weight on our hands. We want to make sure that we're engaging the core actively to keep the spine supported here. So in order to engage the core, once we're in downward facing dog, I want you to think of drawing the pelvic floor up towards your belly button. From there, draw the belly button in towards the spine and then corset the ribs together. So you're creating this locking system all the way from the deep pelvic floor muscles up through the core. Also thinking of drawing the rib cage towards the pelvis, so creating that nice locking sensation there. So everything is strong and active. I hope this is a really helpful downward dog facing downward facing dog tutorial. If you find it helpful, let me know in the comments.